All right, so thanks for joining us tonight for our Lakeside chat on May 11th. We are recording this just in case people miss it and you want to view the video afterwards on our website. You can do that. Tonight, we have attorney Mark Perkell with us, and he has over 35 years of experience guiding business owners, entrepreneurs, and managing the legal affairs of several companies. He's going to be talking about different business entity options tonight and all that goes along with that, which is quite a bit. So thank you very much, Mark, for joining us.
You're very welcome. And I'm hoping if people have questions, I will try to stop a bit before so you can ask questions. What I'm going to do is to go over the various kinds of business entities and give you some points as to advantages, disadvantages, etc. And this may help you in your decisions. You may know people who are trying to make decisions. You may have friends or relatives who are starting a new business, and they come to you and say, well, I'm thinking of doing something, and say, well, I heard the other day that you might want to do this instead. So I just want this to be in layperson's terms. So I'm not going to throw a lot of legalese at you, like the party of the first part or the party of the second part. You won't hear any of that in this. So Adam, you're going to put up the, because we had a little technical difficulty, you're going to put up the first slide, please. Yes, okay, you still get to see me, I guess. There, okay. The first thing I'm going to talk about are sole proprietorships. And this is anybody who's just thinking about starting a business. And as you can see, an individual business owner, it can be a freelancer, it could be a consultant, it is an incorporated business. It can be somebody who's making birdhouses, the local fairs or whatever. It's the easiest way to set up. You just basically open the door, and easiest to solve. Next slide. The advantages is, of course, it's almost no expense to set up. The only thing you might have is if you decide you want to use a business name. So your houses are going as little birdie birdhouses, and so you have to get a what we call a doing business as, a DBA, trade name. You file that at your Secretary of State's office on their website, and then you can use that name. With a sole proprietorship, you have no annual compliance, and the accounting is very easy. You just keep a record of what you made, what you sold, and then at the end of the year, you file a Schedule C on your income tax return, and you fill the information. Okay, next one. The disadvantages are that you're personally liable. Now, of course, if you're selling bird, I don't think you'll have to worry that you're not going to get sued. If, on the other hand, you're selling any kind of food or other products, food products, those come with some liability. Somebody buys goes home, starts to eat it, and then gets sick. And then next thing you know, you get sued. You are personally liable. There is no protection in any way from that. By having a sole proprietorship, let's say business starts to go well, you want to raise some money and start making this and selling it all over the country. The problem you're going to have is that you're very limited in terms of raising money as a sole proprietor. And decide to sell the business at some point, you could have issues regarding transferring assets. maybe you have some agreement supplier, but now it's harder to transfer those agreements. So those are things you need to look at. Next slide. More um, something you're going to see much more often are, and these are unincorporated entities, two or more people getting together to say, hey, let's start a business, let's make this product and we'll do it together. And it can be a business, it could be some sort of venture, it could be building a house together. And you basically say we're going to divide our profits 50-50. And that's a partnership. Slide. Now there's two main types. There's the general partnership, which is generally what most know. That's people getting together and doing a business together. A limited partnership is a little different issue. That tends to be something where you have more than one person, the person who runs the business, and then you have some money, but you don't want to have anything to do with running the business. It's a limited partnership. And partnerships are best if they're formed with a partnership agreement. I cannot emphasize that enough, because it is important that you have in writing talks about how this partnership is going to be run. And to create it, that is the easiest way to do. Advantages and disadvantages. It can be organized with a minimal amount of paper at a very low cost. And you can operate it in several states without having to get special permission from the Secretary of State's office or having to register it, etc. And it certainly has less supervision and regulation. The problems, the disadvantages would be that there's a limited number of people you can really have to make it run right. Otherwise, it should be a corporation. The partnership can be dissolved at any time, and the liability of the partners is unlimited. So you have to be very careful there, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Partners' contributions, unless there's a written partnership agreement, there are things that you need to make sure you cover. You want to make sure that the partners share in the profits and losses equally, that each partner can have an equal say in what goes on. And is the partner expected to contribute money or services or time or whatever that may be? And you can have simple terms. This does not have to be complicated, but please make sure that if you're doing a partnership, that you do some type of partnership agreement. Next. Next slide. We'll talk about taxation. Just so you know, the partnership files what's called an informational return. You file a partnership return, but you don't pay taxes. You actually issue called K-1s, and those show up on your personal income tax. So you won't pay taxes as a partnership. You will simply be whatever profit you made, that profit will show up on your income tax return. As for the tort and contract liability, this is where it gets a little hairy, because each partner can be sued directly. There is no protection that you get in other forms of business entities, which I will explain. You are what are called joint and severally liable. So either one or both of the partners can be sued. So if one of the partners has much greater assets than the other, it's possible that only one partner is sued and the other one is not. Now, if that happens, the partner who's sued can ultimately sue the partner who wasn't sued. But the major risk is always on the partner who has substantial resources to pay a judgment. And so if you have a partner who doesn't have any assets, then you're going to be the one holding the bag. And the relationship between partners is you're both agents and you are principals. And that means either partner can bind the other. So it isn't like you designate per se one partner will do this, one partner will do that. Unless you've been careful about doing a partnership agreement, etc., one partner can bind the other partner. Decisions are made by a majority of vote. So if you have 3 partners, 2 of the 3. If you have 2 partners, now you got another problem. The duration, a general partnership is not perpetual like a corporation. So death, retirement, bankruptcy of a partner can immediately cause an ending of the partnership. And it can be dissolved by a petition of any of the partners. And so you have to be very careful. Sometimes partners will also have what's called a buy-sell agreement. And this is put in place so that, for example, one of the partners dies. What do you do? How do you value that the dead partner had in the business? And these are things, again, that if you're going to do that, please seek some sort of legal help. It can make your lives so much easier. And I had one situation where a guy called me a couple of years ago and he said, my partner died. We were partners for 28 years and we never had an agreement. And now his widow is telling me that if I want to keep the partnership going, I have to pay her $500,000. And he said, what can I do? And I said, not a lot, because they had no agreement. They had nothing that said that if one partner died, the other partner could buy that partner out for so much money. And she kept raising the amount. So just word to the wise in that regard. Okay, next slide. Now we get to something called the limited liability company, which many of you have probably heard of. And this is fairly new. I mean, this has come around in the last 30 years. Before then, you could either do a corporation, a partnership, or a subchapter S corporation. And the limited liability company was there to try to be sort of an amalgam of partnerships and corporations. And it gave you limited liability of a corporation, but with tax efficiencies and much more flexibility that you would get if you were running a partnership. It is also called a pass-through entity. What that means is that if you have a single owner LLC and you make a profit this year, you will simply file a Schedule C on your income tax return and pass all of the profits through to your personal income tax. That's what a pass-through entity is. So all the profits and losses pass through the business to the owners, who then report that on their income tax return. Next slide. Okay, advantages. I set up a lot of LLCs for people because I find them to be very easy to work with. You can have an unlimited number of members. It's easy to set up and to organize, and it's easy to administer. And you don't file a separate income tax return per se, and you report this on your tax return. The LLC, if it has two members, then it will be treated that you have to do a partnership return, but still very easy to work with. The difference with something called an S corp is the fact that you have in here. Let me just mention that you have other kinds of protections with an LLC, especially limited liability. So if you're selling that food and you're selling it under the name of Mark's Best Jam and LLC, and somebody sues, they can only sue the LLC. They can't sue me personally, and that's certainly a great thing to have. Again, you can have an unlimited number of owners, and you can have subsidiaries and other things. Now, the disadvantages, one of the things is you pay self-employment tax. So if you make $100,000 profit from your LLC, you're going to be paying 15.3% self-employment tax, or $15,300. There are some ways to work around that, which I will explain a little more. You must make sure you run your LLC as a business. If you commingle everything and use one checking account for everything, and you just basically don't make it really appear like it is an LLC, you can lose some of your protection. So I just want you to know that. Now, one of the things here is that with an S corp, the ownership, LLCs can have unlimited numbers. S corps can only have 100 shareholders. S corps cannot have non-U.S. citizens as owners, and whereas an LLC can. And S corp needs to have shareholders meetings and directors meetings, and must keep records and have annual meetings. So these are things that are difficult. Transferring of ownership is, though, a little bit easier with an S corp because you have shares of stock, just like when you buy stock on the stock market. So it's much easier to have shares to transfer, whereas with an LLC, you have what's known as a membership interest. And I'll leave that at that. Simply say that shouldn't keep you from doing an LLC in any manner, shape, or form. One key thing is that the profit allocation is important. You can start an LLC. Let's say your Uncle Jack comes along and says, I really like what you're doing. I'll help you with your business. I'll give you $100,000 to start your business, and I want 10% of your profits and 10% of the company. Well, if you're an LLC, you can do that. If you're a corporation or an S corporation, you can't. If Uncle Jack gave you all the money to start the business, Uncle Jack owns the business, and Uncle Jack is entitled to 100% of the profits. So oftentimes where you have friends and family who may, invest a little bit of money, the LLC is so much easier to work with. The only similarities that you'll find is the limited liability company and an S corp have that limited liability protection, so it protects your personal assets. I often say to people that if you're buying an investment piece of real estate and it's a rental property, put it in the name of an LLC, because then if somebody slips and falls and sues you for $10 million, they can only sue the LLC. They can't sue you personally. They can't take away the college funds you've set up for your kids, et cetera, et cetera. So I hope that helps a bit. And as I mentioned, both entities are passed through. We can go to the next slide. Subchapter S, there are two forms of corporations. There's a regular C Corp, and then there's a subchapter S, which is the smaller, I call it the smaller corporation. An S Corp must have at least one shareholder, but can't have more than 100. So if you're trying to raise a whole lot of money with a whole lot of people, you can't use an S Corp if you're going to go over 100 shareholders. One of the advantages is that you can be an employee of an S Corp. You can't be an employee per se of an LLC. You simply take a draw. But you can be an employee of a subchapter S. And again, you have the advantages of the limited liability. And the other thing is that an S Corp is not taxed the way a regular corporation is taxed. A regular corporation, which I will get to, has a double tax situation, whereas the S Corp is again a pass-through. So whatever profit is there at the end of the year ends up showing up on your personal income tax. And it's really, in some instances, what we call a tax election. Advantages, you can pay reasonable salaries. You can gift tax. You can, stock. There are definitely issues there that make it simpler to share some of the ownership of that corporation. But the disadvantages are, again, the limitation of the 100 shareholders. You can only have one class of stock. And as I suggested earlier, the profits and losses can only be distributed in proportion to what the shareholder owns. So if the shareholder put up half the money, they get half of the profits, period. And there is a passive income limitation, which is why S Corps are not used for like rental properties, because the rent from rental properties is considered passive income. So there is a 25% threshold where you can't go above that for that kind of return. So if you were setting something up to protect yourself with a property, you'd want to make sure it was an LLC, not an S Corp. So it's very unattractive per se for real estate businesses. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about C corporations, which is, for all intent and purposes, whenever you hear about corporations, big ones, stock market, they're all corporations. They're all C corporations. And it's its own entity. It's got shareholders. And by owning shares in a corporation, you're not held personally liable for what happens with the corporation. So the corporation gets sued for some reason, you are not personally liable. And because they're presumed to be profit entities, they have an limited number of years of losses that they can reflect. And one of the nice thing is that they can provide benefits like health insurance, and other things like that. And you can have fringe benefits, which are tax deductible to the corporation, but are not counted as income for employees. So when you're doing other kinds of business entities and you provide a car for somebody, yes, the business gets to write off the car, but you as the individual have to show something on your tax return as income that was covered by the fact that they provided you with a car. With a corporation, that's not the case. The corporation deducts it and you don't get charged for it. Same thing with life insurance benefits or disability benefits, parking expenses, transit passes, childcare, meals, travel, and lodging. That's all covered as a deductible for the corporation, and you are not taxed because it was covered. You went on a trip, they covered it. You don't have to pay any income tax on any of that. And they can also, corporations can only, the only ones that can have what we call incentive stock plans. And you don't pay taxes until you exercise an option. So having an option to buy some stock is not a taxable consequence for you. Now, disadvantages, we say double tax. What that basically means is that, let's say the corporation makes $100,000 profit. You're the owner of the corporation, and the corporation will have to pay a tax on that 100,000. And then if it distributes that 100,000 to you as a dividend, then you're going to have to pay a tax on the dividend. So that's where the term double taxation comes into play. And it certainly is something that you're going to want to talk to an accountant before you set up whatever you're going to set up, because you want to make sure that if you have this sense that this is going to provide a lot of profit, how you're going to distribute that profit for this double taxation thing. On the other hand, sometimes what will happen is you can keep profits in the corporation and not distribute them during a particular year, and like for research and development or whatever, and those profits will not be taxed until you distribute them. I'm trying not to get too specific here, but just to let you know that you're going to want counsel when you set up a corporation, because there are advantages that you can take to help you to pay less taxes. Now, I'm not advocating that you are required to pay less taxes, but if you don't want to pay more taxes than you have to, make sure that you get good counsel from both an attorney and an accountant. Next slide. Now, I figure I'll touch on nonprofits. I set up several nonprofits for people, and there's two kinds. I want to make sure that you understand that there's a nonprofit and then there's a nonprofit charity. And there are businesses that are nonprofits that are not charities. And so I will give you some examples of that. And just keep in mind, a nonprofit is any entity that's put together with the intention that it doesn't have shareholders, it doesn't distribute any profits, it can't pay salaries, And as you know, there's many charities, for example, that have all these officers and directors that are getting all kinds of salaries, okay? But there are specific rules and regulations in each state. For example, in Vermont, you can't set up a nonprofit without having 3 directors. Other states are just 1 director. Now, there are 2 types of nonprofits, what we call a public benefit corporation and a mutual benefit. Now, the public benefit corporation is really what we think of as the charity. So if they're doing something to help someone, they're some sort of a cancer research organization, or they're helping children, or they're et cetera. In that way, it can be a nonprofit corporation, or a cooperative or a foundation, but it's for the public benefit. And there you would get a nonprofit. And then if you wanted to be a charity and be able to take donations that are tax deductible, then you need to file with the IRS and request a designation of a 501c3. And that is the actual statute in the IRS code for a charity. And you file a separate application to the IRS after the nonprofit has been set up. And by doing that, once the IRS says, yes, you are a charity, that means anybody who donates to your organization can write that off as a charitable deduction. The mutual benefit nonprofit is a good example, is a golf club, a country club, or it could be Kiwanis. It could be, I don't think Kiwanis is considered a charity, but there are a lot of organizations that are not charities, that are there for the benefit of a group of people, but they have members. There in Vermont, there's the Women's Business Owners Network. And that, until recently, was a mutual benefit nonprofit corporation in which there were members who pay dues, and then the members vote on various issues that come up. In a public benefit corporation, there are no members, and they are run by a board of directors. And each one should have bylaws, and there are certain requirements. If, for example, a public benefit corporation closes down and there's money in the bank, they must turn over that money to another public benefit corporation. Whereas if they were a mutual benefit nonprofit, then whatever money's left over basically goes to the members as they exist. So as you can tell, charities have more requirements, and it is a specialty. So if you're thinking about setting up a charity, please seek legal counsel and also speak with an accountant. I'm a great believer of collaboration between attorneys and accountants, because there's a lot of things that can be to your benefit if people are talking to one another. Now, I think at this point, I will open if there are any questions that any of you have at this point. Okay, you can take that down.
I don't want to jump in and steal anybody's questions. So if anybody
okay.
has one, go right ahead. Stephanie or Heidi?
I guess I'd just make a comment that probably a lot of small companies would often set up a sole proprietorship just for the mere ease of it all. So I think you made a lot of great points about liability, ease, transfer of business. There's many considerations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm not advocating any of these. Each has its own special place. So again, like I said, if you're doing a food product, you have two choices. You can be a sole proprietor, but just make sure you have a good insurance policy to cover you. So if somebody's product liability. So those are the kinds of things you just have to look at. But certainly there are an awful lot of attorneys who will do a consultation for free so that at least you can say to them, I'm thinking of doing this business. What do you think would be best for me to use? And I think, I do have people who come to me and I go, you're not ready for an LLC and you're certainly not ready for a corporation. There are times though, as I did mention in my talk, where you may have someone who comes along and wants to do a partnership with you. And I do highly recommend that you talk to someone, because one of the key issues is you get a business going and then one of the partners dies. That can create a huge mess. Whereas if you had just done a simple agreement between you saying, if one of us dies, this is what we're going to do. So please keep that in mind.
That's a great point. I don't think a lot of people complete the whole thing. They set up the entity. They often maybe aren't aware of the need for a partnership agreement, aren't aware of the potential liability, and don't do succession planning. And that's all part of, I think, really deciding what type of entity would make more sense.
Agreed.
That was, this is Stephanie, sorry. That was a really good point about doing the agreement plan, because I am part of a partnership and I do not have that in place. So that was really enlightening for me. I did have a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I did have a question about as part of a partnership, if I were to start a separate business, either as a sole proprietorship or an LLC, where does an EIN come into play? As a sole proprietor, do I work off the EIN of the partnership, or do I need to apply for a different one?
I would highly recommend that you apply for a different one. If these are going to be separate entities, you don't want your part, you start an LLC and it's some sort of product or service that all of a sudden is very successful. This is your own business, and you don't necessarily want your partner to have their hand on your wallet, as we would say. Okay.
Yeah, good. Yes. Thank you.
And you may want to, in where I have two or more people in an LLC, I have something in their agreement, because there is something called an operating agreement that you need to have or should have in an LLC. And I make specific references to people being able to do other businesses so long as they don't compete with the business that you're both in. Okay. So that may be something at some point you want to make sure that nobody can say that, well, hey, any business you do while we're partners is half mine.
I also think taxation has part to do with it. If you have an EIN, employee identification number, then, and you're in a partnership, maybe you'll be issuing what they call K1, which shows the splits of the percentage of ownership. If you neglect to do an EIN and you're just operating it like a sole proprietor, and typically you'll use your own social, you get to pay all the taxes. So I think there's a whole bunch of considerations outside of liability, transfer of ownership, transfer in event of death, disability. What if you get in a fight with your partner? How are you going to determine who owns what percentage? So that all rolls back into EINs, which rolls into, do you need a separate one for this entity? or are you a sole proprietor and you use your own social?
Great.
I just had a quick question about
Sure.
if you are involved in one of these business entities, whether it's a sole prop or a partnership or an LLC or even a C corp, how difficult is it to switch from one to another if you change your mind or decide that your business should be structured differently?
Well, it's fairly once a year. For example, if you're an LLC, you have 75 days to which you could decide to become a corporation or an S corporation. Okay. And that's every year there's that 75-day window. You can always close the LLC and just be a sole proprietor, etc. In effect, if you have somebody who wants to come in and be your partner, they can be your partner in your LLC. You just have some paperwork that shows that you have kind of a partnership within your LLC. The only thing you need to look at really is taxation. Taxation in the fact that sometimes people will have LLCs and they decide that they want to transfer all their assets to a new corporation. And there are situations where there's some tax liability. That's an accountant question. So before you do it, talk to an accountant. The accountant will say, well, this is how I would structure it so you don't pay any taxes. I just want to warn you about that.
Sure, they could do mock-ups, yeah, and that's a great point. I think a lot of people don't think about tax bonds.
Exactly.
They don't do it when they transfer ownership of the company. They don't often think about it when they transfer real estate, for that matter.
Or they just don't get all the information when they're in one type of business entity, and maybe they just say, oh, it's probably not worth switching into something else, or they don't consider all the ramifications like you're saying.
Yeah, just talk to someone. Don't be penny wise and pound foolish. It's not terribly expensive to have an hour's worth of time from a professional who could save you hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And I mean that sincerely. I just have had people come to me where I wish they had just called me and said, I'm thinking of this. It would have taken 5 minutes, and I would have said, don't do it.
Yeah, it's an issue of what to do or what not to do. I'll totally agree with that. Or how you should modify and change your business if you're growing. Or if you have losses, or if you have substantial gains. The entity impacts the taxation, impacts the decision-making, it impacts the selection.
And what do you do if somebody comes along, you've got a business you're getting going, let's say you own a store, and it's becoming successful, it's an LLC, and one of your friends who you've known or an employee of yours says, listen, I really love this store. I'd really like to be part of it. Can I invest in this store and be a part owner? And that happens all the time. And that's something that make sure you've got things set up so you can do that if you want to.
Yes, okay. It's important to do that, whether things go well or if things go wrong.
Yes.
If things go wrong, you don't want to look back and say, if I only woulda, shoulda.
Yes.
Any more questions from anyone?
No? Okay. Well, this has been enjoyable for me. I always like to, I've done a few of these. I haven't done any in a while, but I've made a similar presentation to a group called Boots to Business, which is to help veterans or people getting out of the services and about to go out into the working world who want to start a business. So they, a couple times a year, have kind of a boot camp weekend, and I will give this a talk similar to this, to help them to decide, what do I do? You know, what kind of business? So again, don't be afraid to ask a professional questions that will save you time and money. Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for being here, Mark. We really appreciate
Okay.
your expertise and answering all of our questions and going through all that information. We know it's a lot and it's really, kind of daunting to some people.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you again.
Mark.
All righty. See you all soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.